All right, today we're jumping headfirst into two of the most dramatic and, let's be honest, often misunderstood chapters in the entire Bible, Ezekiel 38 and 39. We're going to unpack this wild story of a massive invasion, some pretty intense divine intervention, and what it all says about the ultimate promise of security. But before we get into the weeds, let me ask you something. Think about a time you went through something really terrible, a disaster, a major setback, anything. You made it through, right? You survived. But there's always that little voice in the back of your head, that nagging fear, what if it happens again? And that anxiety, that's right where our story begins. So picture this. The prophet Ezekiel is talking to the Israelite exiles over in Babylon. You have to imagine their mindset. These people have lost everything, their homes, their sacred temple, their entire nation. Now they've been promised they can go back home, but they are absolutely haunted by this deep collective trauma. And you can't blame them, right? Their thinking is completely logical. They were wiped out by a powerful enemy once before. What guarantee do they have that some new big empire won't just sweep in and do the exact same thing? So this prophecy we're looking at, it's basically God's direct answer to that very real, very paralyzing fear. And that really gets us to the heart of it all. This entire epic prophecy, it all hinges on one single idea: security. God has promised them a future where they'll be safe. But for the exiles, their past is screaming, "Are you sure about that?" These next two chapters are designed to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that God's promise is unbreakable. Now, what's really fascinating is how the text hammers this point home. See, when an ancient Hebrew author really wanted you to get something, they used repetition. A lot. And in this case, the Hebrew word for securely or in safety, well, it just keeps showing up over and over again. As biblical scholar Dr. Leslie Allen puts it, all this repetition is like a giant blinking neon sign. It's the author's way of basically screaming at the reader, hey, this is the main idea. Pay attention to this. So this isn't just some casual throwaway line. God is establishing that security is the absolute foundation of their future. But how do you prove a promise like that is unbreakable? Well, you've got to put it to the test. The ultimate test. So how does God do it? By staging what you could call a prophetic worst-case scenario. It's maybe not a literal prediction of a future battle, but think of it more like a divine fire drill. It's an imagined crisis cooked up to show that even if the absolute worst thing you could possibly imagine were to happen, God's promise of security still stands. And this really nails the why behind it all. As Dr. Allen explains, the whole point of this massive, kind of frightening vision is just to demonstrate that God is more than capable of handling any threat, no matter how big and terrifying it seems. All right, every worst-case scenario needs a villain, right? And a really bad one at that. So enter Gog of Magog. Now, Gog isn't just some random enemy king. He's more like an archetype, a nightmare cocktail made of all Israel's deepest fears and past traumas, all rolled into one. So who is this guy? The text says he's a foe from the remotest parts of the north. Now, for the exiles, that's a huge red flag. That's exactly where their destroyers, Assyria and Babylon, came from. The name Gog itself probably comes from a real, powerful king from back in the 7th century. Dr. Allen suggests we should think of him as a new Hitler or a new Stalin, a name that's meant to make your blood run cold. And oh, by the way, he's not coming alone. He's got a whole crew with him. Persia, Ethiopia, Put. These are all names of real, distant, powerful places. The text literally calls it a great horde, a mighty army. So you get the picture. It's this massive, seemingly unstoppable force about to crash down on tiny little Israel. This is the ultimate nightmare. But right when the tension is at its absolute peak, when you think, well, they're done for, bam, the narrative pulls a stunning reversal. The entire conflict gets reframed with a single powerful statement. This one line changes everything. Right from the get-go, God declares that this isn't Israel's fight to win or lose. God himself is Gog's enemy. Suddenly, it's not Gog versus Israel, it's Gog versus God. Israel's not even in the ring. They're just the prize that God is protecting. This creates this really fascinating tug-of-war about who's actually in control. On one hand, Gog is marching along thinking, heh, this is my brilliant evil plan. But behind the scenes, the text keeps telling us that God is the one pulling the strings. It's my land Gog is invading. It's my people he's coming against. God is basically using Gog's evil scheme to prove his own point. And here's another brilliant little detail Dr. Allen points out. It's almost like a battle of the word great. Gog has a great horde and a mighty army. Okay, impressive. But God responds with his power, a great shaking, a massive earthquake. It's a verbal smackdown to show, you think you're great? Let me show you what real greatness looks like. So the actual battle, well, it's over in a flash. It's totally supernatural. We're talking earthquakes, plague, hailstorms, the works. But what's really amazing is Israel's part in all this. They don't fight at all. Their job starts after the victory. They're basically the cleanup crew. So after God wins the battle, what's on Israel's official to-do list? First, collect all the leftover weapons and use them for firewood. Second, bury all the bodies to cleanse the land. That's it. Notice their role is entirely post-victory. They're just managing the results of a battle they didn't even have to fight. And the scale of this victory is just staggering. There are so many abandoned enemy weapons left on the field that it provides the entire nation with firewood for 7 years. I mean, think about that. The very tools meant for their destruction become the source of their warmth and their life. Talk about a plot twist. And the cleanup effort itself is just as immense. It takes a full 7 months just to bury all the dead. Now, this isn't just about being tidy. It's a deeply symbolic act. It's about completely wiping the slate clean, purifying the land, and making it safe again, just like God promised. Okay, so we've been through this whole epic drama. The worst-case scenario plays out. God wins in a landslide. So what? What's the final takeaway? What's the ultimate point of this whole vision? Well, the text doesn't leave us guessing. It spells it out pretty clearly. While this was definitely meant to reassure Israel and calm their fears, the primary goal was actually bigger. It was a demonstration for the entire world, so that all the other nations would see what happened and know the power and holiness of God. It's a universal declaration of his commitment to his people. In the end, when you boil it all down, Ezekiel's elaborate, terrifying vision is really about one single powerful truth. It's a truth that gets echoed centuries later by the Apostle Paul. And it provides the ultimate reassurance, not just for the exiles back then, but for us today, framed as one final, provocative question. If God is for us, who can truly stand against us?